This is the story of people who, by every measure, should have died, but didn't. Men left bleeding in the dust. A sailor drifting alone in an empty ocean. A soldier walking through a battlefield that had already claimed thousands. In each case, death was not a possibility. It was a certainty. And yet, something happened. Not luck alone, not strength alone, but a refusal, quiet, stubborn, almost irrational, to accept the end that had already been written for them. What does it take to keep going when survival no longer makes sense? To stand when the world has already decided you should fall. These are not legends. These are documented moments in history where human will refuse to break. This is their story. In 1944, Hiroo Onoda was not a hero. He was a quiet intelligence officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, trained in guerrilla warfare, disciplined, methodical. Before being deployed to Lubang Island in the Philippines, he received a simple order: hold your position. Never surrender. Never take your own life. It sounded like duty. It would become something far more complicated. Because not long after Onoda arrived, the war ended. But he didn't believe it. Leaflets fell from the sky announcing Japan's surrender in 1945. Onoda studied them carefully, then dismissed them as enemy propaganda. He wasn't alone at first. A small group of soldiers stayed hidden in the jungle with him. They scavenged. They fought occasional skirmishes. They survived. But one by one, they disappeared. Some surrendered. Some died. By the early 1950s, Onoda was alone. And still, he continued the war. Years passed. Then decades. The jungle became his entire world. Thick humidity pressing against his skin, insects biting endlessly, the constant tension of being hunted or imagining he was. He repaired his uniform over and over again. He cleaned his rifle with obsessive care. This wasn't madness in the way we might expect. It was something quieter. A man following an order long after the world had moved on. Search parties came. They called his name. They left food. They brought photographs of his family, now older, changed. He watched from the trees and stayed hidden. Because surrender, to him, meant betrayal. 30 years passed. Then, in 1974, something extraordinary happened. A young traveler named Norio Suzuki entered the jungle with a strange goal: to find Onoda. And somehow he did. The two men spoke. Suzuki told him the war had ended long ago, that Japan had rebuilt, that the world had changed. Onoda listened, calm, respectful, and then he said something that defined his entire life. He would not surrender unless his commanding officer returned and gave the order himself. Days later, that officer, now an elderly man, was flown to the island. They met in the jungle, and for the first time in nearly 30 years, Onoda received a new command. Stand down. He stepped forward in full uniform, rifle in hand, still operational. A soldier who had refused to die, not just physically, but mentally. The war had ended in 1945. For him, it ended in 1974. He returned to a world he no longer recognized. But his story remains a haunting question. When does survival become something else entirely? But survival is not always about holding on to the past. Sometimes, it's about enduring the present, moment by moment, with nothing but instinct and will. The next story unfolds far from the jungle, in the vast, indifferent expanse of the open ocean. In November 1942, Poon was just a steward aboard a British merchant ship. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't trained for survival. He was a worker, far from home, navigating a world at war. Then, without warning, everything changed. A German U-boat torpedo struck the ship. The explosion tore through steel. Fire spread. The vessel began to sink. Lim didn't hesitate. He grabbed a life jacket and jumped into the Atlantic Ocean. Behind him, the ship disappeared, along with most of its crew. When the chaos settled, Lim was alone, floating in open water. No land in sight. No rescue in sight. Hours passed. Then, by chance, he found a small wooden raft, an emergency supply platform. Inside, there were limited provisions, biscuits, water, a few tools. It was enough for a while. Days turned into weeks. The sun burned his skin by day. At night, the cold cut through him. Saltwater sores opened across his body. The food ran out. So he adapted. He used a nail to fashion a hook, caught fish with raw ingenuity, collected rainwater using scraps of canvas. Sharks circled, always present, always waiting. At one point, a shark came too close. Lim struck it again and again until it retreated, not out of strength, but out of sheer refusal. Ships passed in the distance, some close enough to see, But they never stopped.